Hi, everyone. Welcome in. I'm just going to give it a few minutes to let all the panelists join us, or all the attendees join us, and then we'll get started. Great. Well, I'll go ahead and get us started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. Thank you for joining us this morning for our panel about replacing the energy attributes of the lower Snake River dams in an era of decarbonization. My name is Claire Money, and I am one of the co-directors, and I'll be facilitating this panel. I have just a few announcements, and then we'll get started. First of all, a little tech warning. Don't worry if you can't see yourself. This is a Zoom webinar, so all the attendees are automatically muted with videos off, so you'll only be able to see and hear the panelists. Throughout the panel, if you have a question, please use the Q&A function to ask it. All of our panelists will be giving their presentations, and then there may be time for a brief Q&A session at the end where the panelists can answer your questions, and they may answer them throughout the presentation as well. But please remember to be courteous of all viewpoints throughout the presentation and the Q&A session. Additionally, if there are any legal professionals in the audience wanting to earn CLE credit for this panel and other panels in the conference, in just a moment, I will be sharing the link to register for CLE credit. And also our alumni board, Friends of Land, Air, Water, helps to provide stipends for students doing unpaid public interest environmental law internships. If you're interested in making a donation to FLAW to help provide students with those stipends, information to do so will also be shared in just a moment. And lastly, the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya peoples. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions in their communities at the University of Oregon and across the land we now refer to as Oregon. Polk would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya peoples in the Willamette Valley and express our respect for the tribal nations of Oregon. And now I'll hand it over to Jason Eisdorfer, who will be moderating our panel. Thanks.
Thanks, Claire. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, good morning, folks. And by that, I mean good morning. If you were brave enough and had enough energy to get up at 8 on a Saturday, I think you're going to be well rewarded with a really interesting and important and timely panel. First of all, I want to give thanks out to Claire, who's also a law student and doing this at the same time. And it's pretty impressive to put the panel together and to take care of all of us. Some of us who need a little bit more technological help than others. So let me tell you what I'm going to do before we kick it over to the panelists. I'm going to set the table for three things. One, I'm going to introduce our panelists. Second, I want to talk about the scope of what we're going to talk about, and maybe more importantly, what we're not going to talk about. And then third, to do a really, really high level context before we turn over to the panelists. So first of all, introductions. So I know all these panelists, and many of you don't. So as they speak, they're going to introduce themselves. I think that's an important part of the conversation that's going on, is to understand where people are coming from and to participate in that broader conversation. So we have Giulia Stefani, the senior attorney with a Natural Resources Defense Council, Nancy Hirsch, executive director of Northwest Energy Coalition, and Scott Sims, the executive director of the Public Power Council. So don't forget to introduce yourselves when you get the floor. In terms of scope, what we're talking about and what we aren't talking about. Let's start with the latter. We are not talking about the question of whether or not to remove the lower Snake River dams or to breach them. That's not a question we're really going to deal with here. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that's a question that's for the larger community in the Northwest. Elected officials need to participate in that. But also there's an element of historical legacy there where there are set opinions, there's set rhetoric and some firmly held beliefs, and sometimes that dynamic can prevent or delay or defer conversation around other important energy matters in the Northwest. And one of them, as an example, is um, what would the replacement of that the energy and capacity and flexibility values of those four dams, what would that look like? Can we do it? What would the timing look like? What kind of planning would you need in order to do that? And it may be that by exploring that question, the can you, it really informs the question of whether you should. And so um, I think the panelists today are really going to focus in on that issue of um, ability to replace and what that would take. And then finally, in terms of introduction, the Snake River comes into the main stem Columbia from the east at just below the Tri-Cities. And there are four dams there, referred to as the four lower Snake River dams. Um, and they are part of the federal Columbia River power system, which is the output of which is marketed by Bonneville Power Administration and serves consumer-owned utilities and investor-owned utilities in the region. And there are those issues related to the fish mortality. And so that's sort of the reason that we're here on the panel. The other reason we're here is that just in the last couple of years, Oregon and Washington um, have passed mandates, clean energy mandates. In Washington, it's the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which applies to all the utilities in the state and requires 100% emission-free resource by 2045. In Oregon, just last year, House Bill 2021 was passed, and that applies to the investor-owned utilities, which is about 70 to 75% of the load in the state. And that is a requirement of 100% greenhouse gas emission-free resource by 2040. So given that context, given the decarbonizing context, and I should say there are local climate change goals in Idaho and Montana as well. And so given those decarbonizing mandates throughout the Northwest, that informs and directs in a way that the conversation of what a replacement strategy might look like. So with that context, I'm going to throw it over first to Giulia to talk about some of the high level context of the dams. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks to everybody who showed up this morning. I'm very grateful for your attention and time. And I want to apologize up front for my voice is not quite what it normally is. I have a bit of a cold this morning. So turn your volume up if you can't hear me. I'll do my best to speak with volume. My name is Giulia Stefani. I'm an attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council. I live in Mosier, Oregon, which is on the Columbia River, just east of the Cascades. And I have worked on this issue for 5 or 6 years. I've been at NRDC for 8 years. And I too am going to put this in a little bit of context. And for all you lawyers at this panel, it is a law conference. I'll give you a little bit of law before we dive into the details on the energy piece of this. And I think it's important. This is an important story for sort of the limitations of the law and also the power of the law at the same time. So putting it in context, Jason's giving you some of the geography. This is Columbia Basin's the size of Texas, roughly. Snake River watershed, its largest tributaries, roughly the size of Idaho. And of course, this is a story that starts at time immemorial, a very complex network of many tribal nations have fished and lived along and relied upon the Columbia River system for all time, and continue to do so today, and have managed this resource using traditional wisdom and knowledge, and continue to be very active managers of the resource in coordination with the federal and state agencies. And about 18, I meant to earlier, but about 1855, well, at 1855, many of the tribes in the basin, not all of them, signed treaties with the federal government. And one of the key provisions in those treaties was the right to fish in all usual and custom places for all time. That remains sort of the beginning, in my mind, of the legal story here. Following the 1855 treaties with the tribes and a period of sort of increasing settlement, industrialization of the river, you start to see an era of dam building. 1938, Bonneville Dam is built on the Columbia, main stem Columbia. 1945, the Rivers and Harbors Act authorizes multi-purpose dams on the Snake River. It's not explicit how many dams are going to be built, but what is clear is that the primary purposes of these dams was for navigation and irrigation. A secondary purpose was hydropower. They were clearly multi-purpose, and you get more dams being built. In 1957, the Dalles Dam floods Celilo Falls. Then the Snake River Dam projects start to be built between the 60s and 70s, the last one being completed in 1975. Really alters the river. I mean, today the river I live along looks a bit more like a series of lakes than a free-flowing river, but it also enables barge transportation up and down the river, all of these dams were built, I will say, before, and I'll talk in a minute, our main sort of what we think of as our bedrock environmental laws. But that's not to say that there was not an understanding of the environmental impacts of these dams at the time they were built. I want to make sure my dates and quotes right here, because I think the quotes are actually quite powerful. In 1947, the U.S. Army Corps consulted with the fisheries departments in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and the federal government, and concluded that the consensus opinion of all of those agencies was that the lower Snake River dams, quote, might entirely eliminate the runs of migratory fish, quote. 1950, U.S. Fish and Wildlife sends a report to the U.S. Army Corps saying that the lower Snake River dams, quote, present the greatest threat to the maintenance of the Columbia River salmon population of any project heretofore constructed or authorized in the basin. That's all, of course, before the dams are built. 1970, so we jump ahead just about the same time as the completion of the dams. The National Environmental Policy Act is passed. This, of course, requires consultation on federal projects and more information to the public. It engages the public in these sort of decision-making processes when there's an environmental impact. 1972, the Clean Water Act is passed. That limits discharges and sets water pollution criteria. This becomes important later when hot water becomes considered a pollutant. 1973, the Endangered Species Act is passed. And this really, in my mind, it's the Endangered Species Act of the three that really kicks off an era of litigation here around the dams. 1986, so about 10 years after the last Lower Snake River Dam was completed, Snake River coho salmon go extinct. In the 1990s, all of the Snake River salmonid populations are listed, and I have to give credit to the tribes for leading on those listings. Once they're listed under the Endangered Species Act, they fall under the purview of the ESA, and we have biological opinions by NOAA Fisheries as to whether or not these federal projects will jeopardize the continued existence of salmon. And those biological opinions are challenged in federal court, and again and again. 2000, 2004, 2008, 2014. biological opinions are challenged, and federal judges repeatedly find that they fail to ensure that the Columbia River Federal Hydropower System will not jeopardize the continued existence of salmon. This is what I think you call between a rock and a hard spot. We are in a cycle of litigation, and federal judges have agreed, and the agencies have, and the tribes poured billions of dollars into salmon recovery in the Columbia River Basin. Extensive projects have been done up and down the river, really Herculean efforts to save these fish, and still coming up short under the ESA. Most recent order from a federal court judge on one of the biops, and I think it's worth a read for you lawyers out there that get into this stuff. The first 20 pages are sort of a recap of the history of the litigation on the river, and just a really fascinating history and story. It's the 2016 order from Michael Simon, U.S. District Court judge out of Portland. It's a 149-page order, so a small novella in itself, and it determines once again that the 2014 BIOP doesn't meet the requirements of ESA, Endangered Species Act, and it requires a new EIS, environmental impact statement, under, I told you I was going to give you some law, under NEPA. So that all kicked off. That was completed under the Trump administration in 2020. We got a new BIOP, a new EIS, and also then shortly thereafter, a new round of litigation. And I want to bring us up where we are today. And that's kind of where I'll wrap up, which is that we are in the middle of this litigation. The litigation has been stayed by the environmental plaintiffs, the Nez Perce tribe, and the state of Oregon, and the federal agencies, and with an agreement to try and work on this is a sort of a pause in the litigation that will terminate, I believe, in July of this summer. And there was a press statement that went out when the stay began that came from the federal government that really indicated a strong desire to work this out, and a recognition of, I think, the complexity of the issue, both the longstanding rights of tribes dating back to 1855 and beyond. I mean, there are non-treaty tribes that have, to whom the federal government has trust responsibilities as well. And in addition, the importance of meeting our climate change and clean energy goals, and then, when you're talking about hydropower, it's an important piece of the equation here in the Pacific Northwest, by no small part of our clean energy equation. So the federal government's taking a look at this till July. At the same time, right around the same time, U.S. Senator Patty Murray, Washington Governor Jay Inslee also said that they were going to take a look at the feasibility of replacing these dams, what it would take if it were determined that this should be part of a package for salmon recovery. So everybody's looking at it. We're in a big pause. It's a really timely moment for us to come together and look at it too. This is a long-standing, very complex issue, and there are, good arguments on all sides. This is a tough one, and so I'm really excited to turn it over to my friend and colleague Nancy Hirsch to start us off on the energy piece of this. And I thank you all for your attention.
Great, thank you so much, Giulia. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, so again, I'm Nancy Hirsch. I'm the Executive Director of the Northwest Energy Coalition. I use she, her pronouns. I am based in Seattle, and I want to acknowledge that I'm on the ceded lands of the Duwamish and the Coast Salish peoples, and I respect their continuing ownership of this land. The Northwest Energy Coalition is a nonprofit advocacy organization. It's a coalition of over 100 organizations in the 4 Northwest states, environmental, consumer, low-income, civic organizations, clean energy businesses, and utilities. So as Giulia ended, it's a time to come together and collaborate and talk. And that's something certainly we do a lot of at the coalition with our very diverse membership, listening to each other, trying to hear and put yourself in the shoes of the other organizations that are members of the coalition, all striving to advance a clean, affordable, and equitable energy future. It takes time and it takes a lot of effort, but it's something that the coalition and our staff are really committed to. So as you all know, and as Jason led off, the energy system is in the midst of a really dynamic and major transformation as we decarbonize energy, fuels, buildings, transportation. The power system itself is becoming more dynamic. Customers are engaged with solar panels on their houses, internet connected appliances, electric vehicles, demanding low and zero emission energy. So it's a dynamic time to be engaged in an energy conversation. And the connection to salmon recovery. Some people are like, well, you know, we got, yeah, these are hydroelectric dams, but really this is about salmon recovery and habitat and other issues related to the natural environment. But there is a strong link between the energy side and the salmon side, and that's planning, right? We need to ensure that we have reliable, affordable, and carbon-free electricity for all communities in the region. And it's as important as recovering Snake River salmon and steelhead. So we have to plan the two things together. And the challenge we face is not really choosing between the two equally compelling goals, but how best to achieve them both. And I think that's the conversation we want to have today. Utilities and power providers regularly assess the value of their system, the value of the resources, the needs of their customers, the costs and reliability of their system and the services that they provide. And so that's kind of an ongoing planning function that happens regularly in our energy system. And it's vital that we understand the value of the lower Snake River dams and the challenges that come in replacing all the services that they provide if the dams are removed. So this is a planning exercise, and therefore it's something that we know how to do because we do that regularly in the power sector. We've done this before. So we've made changes to the energy system. We've replaced coal and nuclear power plants, and they followed a pretty well-trod path to look at replacing resources for those. The Trojan nuclear plant was closed in Oregon. The Boardman coal plant was closed. Coal plants in Washington and Montana have been closed. So first you assess, what do you do about that planning? First you assess the energy value and the power system services that the power plant provides. Then you evaluate the impact on the whole system when that resource is removed. And then you plan out a portfolio of replacement resources that give you the same level of reliability, affordability, and no increase in greenhouse gases, right? So as Jason mentioned early on, we've got some serious carbon commitments in Oregon and Washington and in the other states. And we have to make sure that the replacement portfolio has no increase in emissions. And then the last thing you do is you put out a bid and you ask for resources. And that allows you to put together the most cost-effective portfolio of replacement resources and plan for when you want those resources on your system. We put together, the Energy Coalition put together a kind of a paper that lays out some of this high-level power planning system and what we've done in the past. And I want to share 3 slides from that study, and hopefully this will go smoothly. All right, hang on. There we go. All right, can you all? All right, here's my first slide. Can you all see that? All right, awesome. So this first slide shows the energy services of the Lower Snake hydroelectric dams and the Columbia hydro system and BPA's load. So, and it's a compilation by month from data from the Bonneville Power Administration and the Army Corps of Engineers. And it shows, it's a compilation of 2007 to 2020. And it shows that these, the blue on the bottom are the Lower Snake River Dam hydroelectric output. And then the Columbia hydro system, the rest of the federal Columbia hydro system is the orange. And the line is the Bonneville load. So as you can see, these dams are important. They're about 10% of the Bonneville system, 4% of the region's power. And they do provide support for the system during peak times. But I think the other thing that you can see in looking at this is that they're not huge on the system. They are a modest contributor to the system, and that they are replaceable. Certainly, it doesn't show all of the services that the region, that these dams provide, but that is part of an analysis that would need to be done. But this gives you some context that when the bulk of the blue is on the system is when the system is pretty flush with resources and significantly over demand on the Bonneville system and providing additional services to the investor-owned utilities in the region. Slide 2 looks at the cost of energy resources. So in 2018, the Northwest Energy Coalition sponsored a study by a consulting firm called Energy Strategies that looked at replacement resources. And it's already out of date, that study done in 2018. And costs have dropped by about 50% already for wind, solar, energy storage projects. And this graph is by the National Renewable Energy Lab, and they do an annual assessment of technology costs going forward. And so it picks up in 2021, and it kind of shows the cost projections for replacement resources going forward out to 2030 and beyond. And again, a steep decline in the cost of investing in new resources is really an important factor to think about as we plan for what a replacement resource might look like. And I'll also note that when we did our study in 2018, a key piece of replacement resources are those customer side resources I talked about earlier, the distributed solar, energy efficiency, managing load from your appliances and your buildings. That's a key piece to this portfolio. And my last slide is not here. There we go. There it is. I don't know why it came up like that. Let's see about. All right, well, can you see that? My apologies, I messed up the, there we go. Okay. So this last slide, I want to illustrate what I said before, which is utilities plan for resource changes. You know, even big changes like the closure of the Trojan nuclear plant in 1993, which is about the output of, on average, of the Lower Snake River dams. And then, so the chart on the left shows you the other resources that have been retired in the region. So replacing resources is not new, it's not unusual, we do this. And then the chart on the left says, well, do we have enough resources in our system to close all these coal plants and potentially replace the output from the Lower Snake River dams? And the chart on the right says, yes, we do. Both Pacific Core, that's PAC, and Puget Sound Energy, which is a Washington investor-owned utilities, put out bids for replacement resources. They asked the market at large to provide them with replacement resources for the resources they were closing, the coal plants they were closing. PacifiCorp was looking for 4,300 megawatts, and Puget Sound Energy was looking for 3,200 megawatts. Those are the blue bars. And the orange bars are what they got in bids. So that tells you that not all of those projects are real, and there's certainly overlap. There's the same projects bid into both requests for proposals, but it shows you the depth of the market, the depth of the resources that are available to meet the region's needs. So that's a key component to the conversation, is what's really viable. And all those resources included a broad diversity of resources and storage. So for me, I'll stop sharing. The takeaway is that the region has identified a need to close these generating resources in the past. And if the decision is made to close these resources or to take out the lower Snake River dams, we've done planning, we've done procurement, we've ensured that the power system stays reliable and affordable. And we do it usually in a collaborative manner. So that's where we want to work together to map out what's needed, what's necessary, and how we make the collective changes so that everybody has the reliable and affordable system that we need. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Scott Sims with the Public Power Council.
Thank you so much.
I look forward to the conversation when we're done. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Nancy, for passing the torch over to me. And thanks, Giulia, for your comments. I find it a little bit ironic. So good morning, everybody. I find it a little bit ironic that we're talking about an energy discussion here, and we're now just getting to somebody who's worked for 25 years of their career in the energy industry in the Northwest. And that's okay. I think there's a lot of discussions from the policy world about our energy mix and where we go in the future. But I just really would encourage folks in this, something that I learned along my career is to really focus and listen to the folks who actually work in the energy industry and have the experience of trying to make sure to run a very reliable, very responsible grid and to meet all the other public responsibilities out there, because it is a tall order that is getting tougher. So let me I've also got a little frog in my throat this morning, Giulia, so I'm going to join you there with the with the hoarseness. But let me just tell you a little bit about the Public Power Council first, and then I'd like to address a couple of the comments made. So the Public Power Council is the largest trade association in the Pacific Northwest. It's representing the interests of the nonprofit, community-owned utilities that get all or part of their electricity from the Bonneville Power Administration. Obviously, mentioned Bonneville a little bit earlier. They are a power marketing agency under the Department of Energy. And BPA relies on this network of 31 federal hydro projects and 1 contract nuclear power plant, and serving more than 6 million people across the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and a little sliver of Nevada. And I think from a social justice standpoint, just to get an understanding of sort of who we serve in public power, because it is a little bit of a different footprint. So in Oregon, we serve 9 of the 10 counties with the highest poverty rates in Oregon. And Jason had said earlier, that Oregon does have a heavier investor-owned utility footprint. So my former employer, Portland General Electric, does serve the majority of the actual load, if you will, the consumption of electricity in Oregon. And it's for the consumer-owned utilities that I represent, it's about 35% of Oregon. How that stands out in terms of clean or emissions-free profile, Oregon overall is about 50% on the clean side, and Oregon consumer-owned utilities are in about the 90% realm. So it gives you an idea of kind of the portfolios that the utilities are running. We have 27 nonprofit consumer-owned utilities in Oregon, and they're all locally controlled boards within those communities. And like I said, we have a very high low-income strata, because typically, as the energy system was developed in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere, the investor-owned utilities went to the more urbanized areas areas, and the areas that were more rural were basically left out, which was a big part of why the whole Bonneville system was created, was really to make sure that we could get electrification to all of the citizens of the various communities. I just want to address the a little bit of a background part from Giulia. So Giulia lives just up the road from me. I'm in Hood River, Oregon, and so I get to look at the Columbia River every day as well. I'm a big fan of the Columbia. I spend a lot of time swimming it and paddleboarding it and doing all sorts of other activities. It's a fantastic river system. You're right, the size of Texas, the drainage and all of the tributaries. It's a phenomenal river system, and we need to continue to protect it in the face of what I consider to be a growing climate challenge out there. I would say just up the road from Giulia and me, I would really encourage folks who want to take a field trip in Oregon to go to the Dalles, where the Columbia Gorge Discovery Center is located. I know we weren't going to talk a lot about fish today in this panel, but we certainly spent a lot of time in the beginning. So I would really encourage folks to go to that museum and learn about the canning industry that really decimated the fish runs at the beginning of the century before any of the hydroelectric projects were built. That is a very important chapter in our history where such massive canning and fishing operations right around the turn of the century really drove the salmon numbers down. So it's an important chapter. And I think later on we'll talk a little bit about this, but I also want to make sure to acknowledge that we in this region typically don't talk a lot about fish harvest. And I think it's so important. I'm glad that the opening of the conference, we talked about the tribal treaty obligations and rights. And as Indigenous people, the right to be able to have that as part of their culture, salmon fishing. It's so important, which is why we have to make sure to keep that salmon life cycle intact and do what we can to make sure as many fish come back to these rivers, not only to spawn, but to provide those tribal fisheries. So I also want to acknowledge that while we're trying to work on delivering clean, reliable power, we also are supporting the harvest commercially offshore, including international harvest, which is becoming, I think, more and more of a problem area from countries of South Korea, Russia, others that are harvesting millions and millions of pounds of both hatchery and wild ESA-listed salmon on an annual basis. So we can't ignore that while we're trying to fix some of these issues, we also have a massive take on that. In fact, let me actually just do a really quick share of my screen because I want to show you where we are at with the combined annual salmon and steelhead returns for all species to the Bonneville Dam from 1938 to 2021. And certainly these numbers are very interesting. It's probably very hard to see. Are folks seeing this, by the way? Are you guys seeing the screen? I can't, can you see? Give me a thumbs up, Jason, if you can see it. No,
can't see it, Scott.
Shoot, okay, hang on just a second. This is one of those fun things about bouncing around in technology. Okay, here we go. There, now you can probably see this. So what's fascinating here is you've got a 1938, which is when they started counting for salmon returns and steelhead returns in the Columbia system. Certainly you can see those numbers bouncing along there toward the bottom, and ocean survival is really, or ocean conditions are really one of the big determinant factors for survival. What I think is great to see here is that you did start to see a shift around the early 90s where policies started to be put in place to do more for our fisheries in the region. We started really investing heavily in habitat, in hatcheries, in predation reduction for juveniles and adults. And I think this is tremendous to see. We got to 2014, we got over 2,500,000 returning salmon and steelhead to the Columbia Basin, which, again, these as you'd mentioned earlier, these Snake River dams had been in place, the last one's built in the 70s. So clearly some of those disciplined and concerted investments in the system really did pay off in terms of those returns. I love what Nancy said when she said, we're not choosing between the two, between salmon and between energy, something along those lines. I was trying to write down my notes there, but a balance of both. And I think that's totally, that is exactly where we have to be, is we've got to figure out a way we can continue to have strong fisheries. And I'm telling you, this climate change situation, it's real and it's happening right now. I think last summer with the heat wave that we had across the Pacific Northwest, known as the heat dome, we had a multi-day, I want to say it was about a week of sustained high temperatures in this region, and it ultimately killed a number of citizens across the Pacific Northwest and into Canada. I mean, it's real. Climate change is real and it's happening right now. So what we look at in our world of, as we see more legislation and great requirements around how can we get to a better, cleaner portfolio, we need to make sure we're really focusing on that reliable system, that clean system, and building upon it. And I think some of the things that Nancy has outlined in her plan, although I disagree with some of the conclusions about replacement, I think that some of the things that you're talking about for batteries and solar and wind need to be additive to the system we have, because the system we have right now is barely keeping up. And that's a really important factor to be considering. I think that if we've got any coal plants and we've got any gas plants operating, that's where we should be focusing our attention, because we need to find a way. And I think that looking at the NRDC website this morning, we need to find a way to get the emissions out of the energy portfolio and get more clean resources. And so the one thing that is so important about hydro that everybody really should understand is that the Snake River dams and the whole Columbia system have really fostered and helped build an amazing renewable portfolio here in the Northwest of additional renewables on top of the hydro renewable, which is a wind fleet of plus 6,000 megawatts, which is huge. Now, the problem with the variable resources like wind and solar is that they do come and go as they please, because they're powered, of course, by the conditions around them, right? Sunshine and wind. So I always say that if the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, at least we still have clean Northwest hydro. So you can take that one to the bank. But I think that's really an important part of this discussion is, how do we make sure we have these baseload resources, these resources that can be brought on quickly and to address the peak needs that start to emerge in the system. Coal plants are retiring, and natural gas plants are being retired as well. That puts more and more pressure on any kind of a resource that is what we call a baseload resource or a dispatchable resource. Nuclear power and the small modular reactor discussions that are taking place right now is something that folks are exploring. These safer, smaller reactor units that can be essentially deployed and ramped up and down more quickly than some of the old legacy units. Improvements to the hydro system. I'm really excited by the kinds of things we've been able to do incrementally over the years to help get more power production out of the system and also make it safer for fish. So folks might be interested in the case study of the Ice Harbor Dam, which is one of the Snake River dams. 2016, we actually revised the turbines on that to make them more fish friendly, and we got about 3% more hydropower production out of those. So I agree that this is something we've got to work on in totality as a society and as a group. I do think sometimes when we get in this Lower Snake River Dam discussion, because climate change is so real and outside our front door, that I sometimes feel like we're doing the dinner seating chart on the Titanic. Like it's the wrong place to focus, because outside is that looming iceberg that's real. And I guess in climate change context, it's melting. But I do think it's really important that we're going to be focusing on how can we improve the energy system we have today, and how can we build on that and reinforce it, and how can we work together. I think there's a lot of great harvest reduction and management opportunities in the offshore areas. There's this, I don't know if folks are aware, but NOAA has what's called the illegal, it's the illegal and unregulated fisheries efforts, where they've got basically a group that is out there trying to really police those international waters, which really brings more fish back to us for domestic purposes. And we can't ignore as well these energy policies that are emerging in the West, and that are really, again, driving us to find the best path forward. And Nancy, you and I have talked. I do look forward to us continuing to partner. We do have some disagreements on some of the fundamentals around your study. So again, I would really say for folks walking away from today's conversation, I would say, yes, additive to what we already have. If we actually take the Snake River dams and look at how we would replace them, I think it would actually take us backwards. And as long as we've got places like Hawaii that are 60% liquid fossil fuel dependent for their energy source, we got a lot more work to do. And as we all know, climate change knows no bounds. We have a lot more work to do in our industry and across our world to reduce the impacts on climate. And I'm proud that this region is close to meeting the 100%. So I'll just pause there, because I know we want to make sure to get other folks to have a chance to speak up, or Jason, for you to ask some questions.
Well, that was great, you guys. And I do have sort of a broader question that I would like you guys to try to answer for me. So Scott, you did a good job at the end there of talking about some of the specific challenges as we start to comply with the decarbonization mandates in the Northwest, it does mean that we're relying more on renewables, which are generally variable resources and non-dispatchable. And so that challenge of meeting peak is something that folks are spending a fair amount of time on, and collaborative conversations around resource adequacy. But that is one of the big challenges. But we have to do that anyway, right? And so the question is, where does that incremental need, if you were going to replace the 4 lower snake dams, how does that incremental role play into that? It's something we got to do. What is that incremental element? And so I guess the question is, if we were going to, you and Nancy disagreed on some stuff, but you also agreed on some things.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of interested in what is that forum? What does that forum look like? Does it exist? Is it the Northwest Power Conservation Council forum? Is it the national labs that are doing analysis? Is it the utilities separately doing analyses? How do we get folks around that table to have that conversation about what planning, what analysis needs to be made, and then what planning needs to be done, and what resources need to be developed? So what does that process look like? What does that conversation look like? And that's for all three of you.
Anybody else want to start, or do you want me to start?
You can start.
Okay, well, I would just say, so thank you for that question, because I think that's true. We can't just be in a perpetual impasse. I think we have to really change the way we're looking at the argument and the issues that are on the table. We have to stop, I think, the perpetual cycles of litigation, because I think it's, it doesn't foster the connectivity that we're going to need to try to figure this out. I think we have to put all the issues on the table as well. So we, classically in this region talked about the 4 H's. So hydro is one of those, and we're definitely drilling in and really focusing on the hydro aspect. But there's also the important aspect of hatcheries and their production role and the funding that we've traditionally provided for hatcheries. And then we also have the habitat aspect. So how are these fish sheltering and finding cool water refuge and finding foraging areas, especially against a backdrop of increased pollution? And then last, the harvest aspect. So I think in order for us to have a productive and good conversation, just like trying to talk through something that's difficult for a family or that kind of thing, you've got to put it all on the table to get it talked through. And I think we need to look at this holistically and not just in one of the H's. So I don't know exactly what forum is the best. I think there's some good and bad in all kinds of different constructs, and we've got to figure out an inclusive process. I do think, having just come out of a federal EIS process 18 months ago, that was a $50 million process, it did involve the entire region, and there were changes made to the hydro system and operations after that review. So I think that was an important and a productive chapter, but yet we're back into the litigation cycle. And so I think we need to figure out a path that's sustainable for all the interests involved. And I do appreciate, by the way, earlier mention of the other multi-purpose aspects of these river facilities, because you do have navigation, flood control, recreation, irrigation, water withdrawal. So there's other parts of the river picture that would be at the table. And I'm open to hearing other ideas for a forum. Thank you.
I can jump in. It's hard to envision how we get past the impasse we've been in. And I kind of feel like the emphasis on climate is, a good motivator, right? And it is because of climate change that we're focused on these 4 dams, because the water behind these dams, that heat wave that affected people also affected the river, and put the river over this long series of lakes over 70 degrees, right? Which is lethal for a lot of the fish and wildlife in the river system. So while on one hand, because of climate change, we don't want to remove carbon-free, emissions-free hydroelectric projects, and at the other side, it is because of climate change that we have to. So that drives us to have a conversation about, what does the full picture look like? And I completely agree. We cannot solve one piece of the puzzle, put in one piece and call it good. We've got to put it all together. And I think one thing that is motivating us right now is we have a moment where there is a lot of federal attention in the region and a lot of federal resources that are available from infrastructure spending that can help us invest in our system to help it transform and make the clean energy investments and the transportation infrastructure investments that we need. And I would hate for us to let that window close without seizing some of the federal investments that are coming out right now and over the next couple of years. So that's a big motivator for us to really get to the table and have a conversation.
Julie, do you want to jump in or?
I'm happy for you to go to the next question. I think Scott
Okay.
answered it.
Okay, great. We did get a question and a comment about the Northwest Power and Conservation Council and what that role is. And it should be noted that they did come out recently with a proposal they're going to take back to the council members about doing something very similar to what we're talking about here, which is doing an analysis of the values of the 4 lower Snake River dams, what removing them would, the impact it would have on the rest of the system, and what kinds of options there would be, both supply side and demand side, to sort of fill that gap. Is that the kind of conversation that you guys think would be a useful dialogue within the region?
Well, I could jump in and say, I don't think so, because I think the scope is too narrow. And I think it's just on the heels of, like I said, a major environmental impact statement conducted by the federal government. And I think there is a little bit, not a little bit, there's probably a lot of lack of faith in the council's ability to do this appropriately, because they have actually got a model that they use for the power planning purposes that has been a real, it's struggled, I'll just say that. And I think that there's some real concern across the industry, not just in consumer utilities, but across the entire Pacific Northwest with some of the investor-owned utilities, with the quality of the outputs for that model and its abilities. So I would say that I think, again, we've got to probably widen the aperture here if we're going to have a real dialogue about all the issues and the interplay, rather than just having yet another study coming from an entity that's not actually running the power grid, it's observing. And I think it's really important to make sure that there are folks who are deeply involved in the daily and the monthly and the yearly operations of these facilities to try to meet reliability and compliance objectives. Those are the folks who need to be at the table. And it's something I heard many years ago, earlier in my profession, from a planner who said, I'm worried, an engineer who said, I'm worried that the policy people are overtaking the engineers and the planners in this business, and they have good intentions, but they don't have the experience. And I think that's something that for us to take to heart, that I do think when we have these discussions and we bring everybody around the table who are quote unquote experts, I do think we need to make sure we're bringing those veterans of the industry to the table. I learned some of my best learnings from an Iranian-born and trained engineer who came to America because she couldn't get the opportunities in Iran, and she and I worked together on a Portland General Electric siting of a natural gas plant. And I learned so many things from her being able to just be open about what the company was trying to do with this plant and where it was trying to go, and some of the trade-offs and the objectives. So I would say my encouragement to folks is spend some time with people who work in the industry to really understand what we're facing, and the serious issues that are at play regarding reliability and, frankly, human lives and salmon lives. So I think, again, long answer, sorry, to that question about the council, but I think we got to open the aperture here.
And while I would say on the energy side, while we don't love everything that the Power Council has put out, I do think that they have the modeling tools that the Bonneville Power Administration does not have. It's the BPA environmental impact statement that Scott mentioned. It was not really a resource plan because Bonneville doesn't really do resource planning because the Power Council is vested with that responsibility in the region. And so they have developed the tools to do the resource planning. And I think from the energy side, they are probably the best entity to bring all the system operators as well as the policy guidance of the states together to really look at the value of those projects and the impact of replacement resources. So while I'm nervous about the Power Council stepping forward, I think there is no better entity that has a grasp on how the system operates than they do.
And I might just challenge it a little bit to say, I would really also encourage folks to look up what's called the WRAP, the Western Resource Adequacy Program. That is a fantastic forum as well, because you've got investor-owned utilities and consumer-owned utilities looking, and Bonneville and others looking across the entire West. And I think that's really helpful, because I think there's also some really terrific renewables opportunities. If we can get some of these market connections right, and we can get some transmission built, we can actually build upon regional differences where the wind is blowing and where it's not, where the sun is shining and it's not, where the hydro is performing and it's not, and we can try to network that and optimize the system so we can really get to what I think the NRDC and others, and we share the same thing. How can we get to that 100% carbon-free environment?
So Scott, I do think that I know that we're running short of time, but I do think that that point that you're making strikes me as really important for this conversation. I've been involved in integrated resource planning with utilities for 25 years, and I do know that you don't always leave the resource planning up to the utility or the PMA. You need to have public input. You need to have a wider perspective. And I think the resource adequacy conversation is looking at that wider conversation. So I think one of the themes here is really, I think you've made this point. I think all three of you in one way or another sort of made the point that this is a regional, this is a community conversation. I think all points of view are going to be really important, both from the utility or the BPA that needs to meet that load, to the utilities they serve, or to the customers ultimately they serve. All those voices are going to need to be listened to and brought in. And I just want to relay some optimism that I think that there, as much as some of you guys disagreed, there was still quite a bit of agreement on at least analysis going forward. Am I feeling that optimism correctly?
Definitely for me. I mean, climate change is real. It's right here. It's happening.
Yeah, I think we're all committed to a reliable system, and but that system is changing, and it is becoming more diverse and dynamic, and which is creating challenges for the system operators, and we're overcoming it. And the wealth, fortunately, Mother Nature's providing a lot of wind and solar resources for the region, and we're able to utilize those with other technologies and integrate them in a way that creates a reliable system. And that's what we're all striving for.
And I think that backbone of hydro is a perfect building block to bring more renewables into the Northwest, which is why we've got to be careful about taking a step back. Yeah.
Okay, Claire, I think we've done what we can do. I think there are steps that we need to take forward as a region. But I think there's some building blocks we can work with. So Claire, again, I appreciate you helping bring us all together for this important panel.
Of course, thank you all so much for coming. I know there were a lot of questions we didn't have time to answer, so I'm sorry about that. But thank you all so much for attending. And if none of the panelists have any closing remarks, then I will end the webinar.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Have a good day.
Have a good day.